Blazing sunset sky. New York, 1917. Margaret Hayes stood at the altar, waiting for Sergeant Henry Whitaker to return on leave for their wedding. But the telegram arrived before he did killed in action. 3 years later, she stepped into a crowded train station and saw him standing there alive. And wearing a wedding ring that wasn't hers. Chapter 1. The Ghost in Grand Central. The air in Grand Central Terminal hung thick with the scent of coal smoke, sweat, and the faint, metallic tang of anticipation. Margaret Hayes navigated the throng of bodies, her kid leather gloves tightening around the handle of her small, worn suitcase. 1920, 3 years. 3 years since the telegram had shattered her world, turning her from a bride to be into a widow before the wedding. 3 years of mourning a man who, until this very moment, she believed lay buried in some forgotten field in France. She'd come to the station on a fool's errand, a whisper of hope ignited by a cryptic message from a friend, a nurse who had served alongside him. A message that spoke of a sighting, an impossibility.
Henry, alive.
The words had felt like a betrayal of her grief, a cruel joke played by a universe that had already taken too much. Yet, here she was, her heart a trapped bird fluttering against her ribs. The crowd surged, a wave of uniforms and tearful farewells. The war was over, but its ghosts lingered, etched on the faces of the returning soldiers, in the hollows of their eyes, the stiffness of their salutes. Margaret scanned the faces, each one a fleeting hope, a potential heartbreak. She'd memorized every line of Henry's face, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the small scar above his left eyebrow, a memento from a childhood tumble. She traced those features 1,000 times in her mind, in the faded photograph she kept tucked inside her locket. Then she saw him. Across the vast expanse of the terminal, amidst the swirling chaos, he stood. Tall, broad-shouldered, the familiar tilt of his head, it was undeniably Henry. Her breath hitched, a strangled gasp caught in her throat. The world seemed to tilt, the cacophony of the station fading into a dull roar. It was as if the intervening years had evaporated, leaving her standing once more at the altar of St. Patrick's Cathedral, the scent of lilies and the promise of forever heavy in the air. But this wasn't the altar. This was Grand Central, and the man she was staring at, the man who was supposed to be dead, was different. There was a hardness in his jaw that hadn't been there before, a shadow in his eyes that spoke of horrors she couldn't fathom. He was older, weathered, a stranger wearing the face of her lost love. He turned, his gaze sweeping across the crowd, and for a heart-stopping moment, their eyes met. His expression flickered surprise, recognition, and then something else. Something that chilled her to the bone. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was guilt? Fear? Margaret took a hesitant step forward, her legs trembling. She wanted to call out his name, to run to him, to feel his arms around her, to erase the nightmare of the past 3 years. But something held her back. A detail, a small, glinting anomaly that shattered the fragile illusion of reunion. On his left hand, nestled beside the strong, calloused fingers she remembered so well, was a gold band. A wedding ring. A ring that wasn't hers. The sight of it was like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. The world, which had momentarily righted itself, spun violently out of control. He was married. Henry, her Henry, was married to someone else. The telegram, the death notice, the years of mourning, had it all been a lie? Or had something even more unfathomable occurred? She stood frozen, a statue amidst the swirling tide of humanity. The man who looked like Henry Whitaker, the man who wore his face and carried his ghost, began to walk away, disappearing into the crowd. Margaret watched him go, her heart a shattered mosaic of grief, confusion, and a burgeoning, terrifying sense of betrayal. The fool's errand had led her not to a reunion, but to a mystery far more complex and painful than she could have ever imagined. The ghost in Grand Central had a name and a life that she no longer recognized. And Margaret knew, with a sickening certainty, that her life, once again, was about to change irrevocably. She needed answers, even if those answers threatened to destroy what little remained of her heart. Chapter 2. A stranger's familiar face. The crowd swallowed him whole, leaving Margaret adrift in a sea of unanswered questions. She felt a hand on her arm, a gentle pressure that pulled her back from the precipice of despair. It was Clara, her friend, the nurse who had sent the fateful message. Clara's face, usually bright and optimistic, was etched with concern. "Margaret, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." The irony of the statement was almost unbearable. Margaret managed a weak smile, a pathetic attempt at normalcy. I think I did, Clara. I think I just saw Henry." Clara's eyes widened, her gaze darting towards the direction where Henry had disappeared. "You saw him? But that's impossible." "The telegram, I know," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "But it was him, Clara. I'm sure of it. Only he was wearing a wedding ring." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Clara's hand tightened on Margaret's arm, her expression a mixture of disbelief and pity. "A wedding ring? Margaret, are you certain? Perhaps it was someone who just resembled him." Margaret shook her head, the image of Henry's hand, the glint of gold, burned into her memory.
"No.
It was him. But he's changed. He's not the Henry the first knew." The two women stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the station swirling around them. Clara, ever practical, finally broke the silence. "What are you going to do?" Margaret looked at her, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She should walk away, she knew. She should return to her quiet life, to the small apartment she had painstakingly rebuilt after Henry's death. She should pretend she hadn't seen him, hadn't seen the ring. But she couldn't. "I have to find him," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I have to know what happened. I have to understand everything." Clara nodded, her expression resolute. "I'll help you. We served together in France, remember? We faced worse than this." A flicker of gratitude warmed Margaret's heart. Clara's unwavering support was a lifeline in the storm that was brewing. "Thank you, Clara. I don't know what I'd do without you." They began to search, their eyes scanning the faces in the crowd, their hope dwindling with each passing minute. The station was a labyrinth, a chaotic maze of platforms and passageways. Finding one man in this throng seemed an impossible task. As they searched, Margaret replayed the brief encounter in her mind, trying to dissect every detail. His reaction, the guilt, the fear. It wasn't the reaction of a man who had simply moved on, who had found love after loss. It was the reaction of a man hiding something. They questioned station workers, showed them Henry's photograph, the one she had carried with her throughout the war, throughout her mourning. But no one recognized him. He had vanished, a ghost swallowed by the city. Finally, exhausted and disheartened, they sat on a bench near the information booth, the weight of the situation settling upon them. Margaret felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had come so close, only to have him slip away again. Then Clara noticed something. A small, leather-bound notebook lying on the floor near the bench where they had seen Henry standing. It had likely fallen from his pocket. Margaret picked it up, her fingers trembling. The leather was worn, the edges frayed. She opened it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The first few pages were filled with scribbled notes, logistical details, numbers, and names that meant nothing to her. But then, she turned a page and saw a name that made her breath catch. Elise Dubois. And beneath it, an address in Greenwich Village. It was a woman's name. And the address, it was a start. A thread, however thin, that she could follow. A flicker of hope, rekindled in the ashes of her despair. The stranger with Henry's familiar face had left a trail, and Margaret was determined to follow it, no matter where it led. The mystery of the wedding ring, the ghost in Grand Central, was far from over. It had only just begun. Chapter 3. The Ring and the Lie. The Greenwich Village address led them to a brownstone, its facade weathered but elegant, a stark contrast to the bustling chaos of Grand Central. Ivy climbed its walls, reaching towards windows shrouded in lace curtains. The air hummed with a quiet, bohemian energy, a world away from the rigid formality of Margaret's uptown life. Clara glanced at Margaret, her expression questioning. Are you sure about this? We don't even know who this Elise Dubois is. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for the ornate brass door knocker, shaped like a coiled serpent. I have to know, Clara. I have to know who she is, what her connection is to De Henry. The name felt foreign on her tongue, tainted by the image of the wedding ring. She knocked, the sound echoing through the quiet street. A moment of silence stretched, thick with anticipation. Then, the door creaked open, revealing a woman with striking emerald eyes and a cascade of auburn hair that framed a face both beautiful and wary. Yes, the woman asked, her voice a melodic blend of French and American accents. Margaret swallowed, her prepared speech dissolving in the face of this unexpected reality. We were looking for Elise Dubois. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. I am Elise Dubois. May I ask who is inquiring? Margaret hesitated, unsure how to proceed. She couldn't simply blur out her connection to Henry, not yet. My name is Margaret Hayes, and this is my friend, Clara Miller. We found this notebook, she said, holding up the leather-bound book, and your name and address were inside. Elise's eyes flickered to the notebook, her expression unreadable. She opened the door wider, inviting them in. Come in, please. We can discuss this inside. The interior of the brownstone was a haven of art and literature. Bookshelves lined the walls, overflowing with volumes in various languages. Paintings adorned the walls, a mix of abstract and impressionistic styles. The air smelled of incense and old paper. They sat in a small parlor, furnished with plush velvet chairs and a low table laden with a silver tea service. Elise poured tea, her movements graceful and deliberate. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the clinking of china. Finally, Elise spoke, her gaze fixed on Margaret. The notebook, you said you found it. Where? Margaret recounted the events at Grand Central, omitting the crucial detail of her personal connection to Henry. She described seeing him, the wedding ring, his fleeting expression. Elise listened intently, her face a mask of composure. When Margaret finished, she remained silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. The man you describe, he is my husband, she said, her voice soft but firm. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had known, on some level, that this was the truth, but hearing it spoken aloud, by the woman who wore Henry's ring, was devastating. Your husband? Margaret stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Elise nodded. We were married in France 2 years ago. His name is Henri Dubois. He changed it legally after the war. The lie, so smoothly delivered, so carefully constructed, was almost breathtaking in its audacity. Margaret felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment towards this woman who had stolen her life, her future. But beneath the anger, a deeper, more profound emotion stirred, fear. What had happened to Henry? What had driven him to abandon his name, his identity, his past? And what role did Elise Dubois play in this elaborate deception? Margaret looked at Clara, her eyes pleading for help. Clara, ever perceptive, stepped in. Mrs. Dubois, she said, her voice calm and steady, we understand this must be confusing. But we have reason to believe that your husband may be suffering from amnesia. A war injury, perhaps. It was a gamble, a shot in the dark. But Elise's reaction was telling. Her composure faltered, a flicker of panic crossing her eyes. She quickly regained control, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Amnesia? Elise said, her voice slightly strained. That's absurd. Henri is perfectly fine. But her eyes betrayed her. They darted nervously around the room, avoiding Margaret's gaze. The ring on her finger, a symbol of her supposed marriage, seemed to mock Margaret, a constant reminder of the lie that stood between them. The truth was buried, hidden beneath layers of deception. And Margaret was determined to unearth it, piece by painful piece. The serpent knocker had led her into a den, but she had a feeling that there was more to the story of Henri and Elise and their dangerous secrets. Chapter 4. Echoes of the unsaid vows. The tension in the parlor thickened, a palpable weight pressing down on them. Elise's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of the fear and uncertainty that lay beneath. Margaret, despite her own turmoil, felt a surge of grim satisfaction. The lie was unraveling, and she was determined to pull at every loose thread until the whole tapestry of deception came undone. "Mrs. Du Bois," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "I understand this is difficult, but I need you to be honest with me. The man you know, as Henri Du Bois, he has a past. A past that he seems to have forgotten, or perhaps chosen to forget." Elise rose from her chair, her movements agitated. She walked to the window, her back to them, her gaze fixed on the street below. "I don't know what you're talking about. Henri is my husband. We have a life together. A life built on a lie," Margaret countered, her voice rising slightly. "He was engaged to be married before the war."
To me.
The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken vows, of a future that had been stolen. Elise turned, her eyes flashing with anger. "Engaged? That's impossible." "He never mentioned any." She stopped, her voice trailing off. Clara stepped forward, her tone conciliatory. "Mrs. Du Bois, we're not here to accuse you of anything. We simply want to understand what happened. Your husband Henri, he may be in danger. If he's suffering from amnesia, he may be vulnerable, susceptible to manipulation." Elise's expression softened slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing her features. She sank back into her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He has been different lately.
Distant.
He has nightmares, terrible nightmares. He calls out names in his sleep. Margaret's heart ached at the thought of Henri, tormented by memories he couldn't understand, trapped in a life that wasn't his own. "What names does he call out?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elise hesitated, her gaze shifting between Margaret and Clara. He calls out Margaret," she said, the name a reluctant admission. The word, spoken by Elise, felt like a shard of glass piercing Margaret's heart. It was a confirmation, a validation of her deepest fears, but also a glimmer of hope. He remembered on some level. He remembered her. "He also talks about the war," Elise continued, her voice trembling. "About battles, about friends he lost. He wakes up screaming, covered in sweat." Margaret closed her eyes, the images conjured by Elise's words too painful to bear. She saw Henri, not the hardened stranger she had encountered at Grand Central, but the young, idealistic man she had fallen in love with, the man who had promised her forever. "We need to see him," Margaret said, her voice firm. "We need to talk to him." Elise shook her head, her eyes filled with fear.
No.
"It's too dangerous. He wouldn't understand." "Dangerous?" Clara asked, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean, dangerous?" Elise hesitated, her gaze darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "There are people who don't want him to remember. People who would hurt him." The revelation sent a chill down Margaret's spine. This was more than just a case of amnesia, more than a simple love triangle. There were darker forces at play, secrets that reached far beyond the confines of this elegant brownstone. Margaret stood, her resolve hardening. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice ringing with determination. "I've already lost him once. I won't lose him again."
"I need to see him, Elise. And you're going to help me."
Elise looked at her, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. The echoes of the unsaid vows, the ghost of a love that had been stolen, hung heavy in the air. The ring on Elise's finger was no longer just a symbol of betrayal, it was a link to a dangerous past, a past that Margaret was determined to confront, no matter the cost. The parlor, once a sanctuary of quiet elegance, was now a battleground. And the first shots in the war for Henri's memory and his heart had been fired. Chapter 5. Letters from a dead man. Elise, cornered and increasingly desperate, finally conceded. A late-night meeting was arranged, a clandestine rendezvous in a small, secluded park near the Hudson River. The risks were immense, but Margaret felt a surge of adrenaline-fueled determination. She was getting closer to Henri, closer to the truth. Before leaving the brownstone, Elise retrieved a small, wooden box from a hidden compartment behind a bookshelf. These are his, she said, her voice trembling as she handed the box to Margaret. Letters. From before we met. Margaret took the box, her hands shaking. The wood was smooth and worn, the edges softened by time. She opened it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, nestled amongst faded ribbons and dried flowers, were stacks of letters, tied together with twine. The handwriting on the envelopes was unmistakably Henry's. She recognized the familiar slant of his letters, the way he dotted his I's and crossed his T's. Each envelope was addressed to her, to Miss Margaret Hayes, at her old address, the address she had shared with her parents before everything had changed. These were the letters he had written to her from the front, letters filled with love, longing, and the horrors of war. Letters she had never received. She pulled one out at random, her fingers tracing the faded ink. The date on the postmark was from 1917, just weeks before the telegram had arrived, announcing his death. She began to read, her eyes blurring with tears. His words, written in the trenches, amidst the mud and the blood and the constant fear of death, were a testament to their love, a poignant reminder of the life they had planned, the future they had dreamed of. He wrote of his longing for her, of his dreams of their wedding, of the children they would have, of the home they would build together. He wrote of the mundane details of his daily life, the camaraderie of his fellow soldiers, the constant gnawing hunger, the relentless rain. He wrote of the horrors he had witnessed, the friends he had lost, the fear that gnawed at his soul. But through it all, his love for her shone through, a beacon of hope in the darkness. He promised her he would come home, that he would survive, that they would be together again. Margaret clutched the letter to her chest, her body shaking with sobs. These letters, these ghosts of a past that had been stolen, were proof of his love, proof of the life that had been ripped away from them. Clara placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Margaret, we need to go. It's almost time." Margaret nodded, wiping away her tears. She carefully placed the letter back in the box, closing it gently, as if afraid to disturb the fragile memories it contained. These letters were more than just words on paper, they were a weapon, a tool that she could use to unlock Henry's memory, to break through the walls of deception that surrounded him. As they walked towards the park, the city lights blurring in the distance, Margaret clutched the box tightly. The letters from the dead man were a lifeline, a connection to the past, and a key to the future. She had a feeling that, armed with these testaments to a lost love, the meeting in the park would be far more than a simple conversation. It would be a confrontation, and the fight to reclaim not just her fiancé, but also the man he was meant to be, continued. Chapter 6. The Widow's Waltz. The park was shrouded in darkness, the only illumination coming from the distant glow of streetlights and the faint glimmer of the moon reflecting on the Hudson River. The air was cold and damp, a chilling reminder of the approaching winter. Margaret shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. The wooden box containing Henry's letters felt heavy in her hands, a tangible weight of the past. Clara stood beside her, her presence a source of quiet strength. They waited in silence, the only sound the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore and the distant rumble of the city. After what felt like an eternity, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Elise, her face pale and drawn, her eyes darting nervously around the park. She was alone. "Where is he?" Margaret asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Elise shook her head, her voice trembling. He wouldn't come. He said it was too dangerous." Margaret felt a surge of frustration, mixed with a growing sense of dread. Dangerous for whom? For him? Or for you? Elise didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the ground. She seemed to shrink in on herself, her body language radiating fear and defeat. "Elise," Margaret said, her voice softening slightly, "you need to tell me what's going on. What are you afraid of?" Elise looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and defiance. "I can't. They'll hurt him. They'll hurt us both." "Who are they?" Clara asked, her voice firm. Who was controlling him? Elise hesitated, her lips pressed tightly together. She looked as though she were about to speak, then stopped, her eyes widening in terror. A rustling sound came from the bushes behind them. Margaret whirled around, her heart pounding in her chest. A figure stepped out of the shadows, tall and imposing, his face obscured by the darkness. "Elise," the figure said, his voice a low growl. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was unfamiliar, but it sent a chill down Margaret's spine. It was a voice of authority, of menace. Elise cowered, her body trembling. "I was just silence," the figure commanded. He stepped closer, his features slowly becoming visible in the faint moonlight. He was an older man, with a stern face and cold, calculating eyes. He wore a dark suit, impeccably tailored, and carried himself with an air of quiet power. He looked at Margaret and Clara, his gaze dismissive. "And you two, you should leave. This is none of your concern." Margaret stood her ground, her chin lifted in defiance. "It is my concern. The man you're controlling, he's my fiancé. He was supposed to be dead." The man's eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. He studied Margaret for a moment, his gaze assessing. "Ah," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "The widow. I've heard about you." The word widow felt like a slap in the face, a cruel reminder of the years she had spent mourning a man who was still alive. "What have you done to him?" Margaret demanded, her voice trembling with anger. The man smiled, a cold, predatory smile. "I saved him. I gave him a new life, a new purpose. He's better off without you, without the burden of his past." "You brainwashed him," Clara accused, her voice filled with disgust. The man shrugged. "Call it what you will. He's a valuable asset. He has skills, knowledge that are useful to certain organizations." Margaret felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Her Henry was being used, manipulated, his memories erased, his identity stolen. She stepped forward, her hand reaching for the wooden box. "I have proof," she said, her voice shaking. "Proof of who he is, of who he was. Letters from him to me." The man's smile vanished. His eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "Give me the box," he demanded. Margaret hesitated, her fingers tightening around the box. She knew that handing it over would mean losing her only leverage, her only connection to Henry. But she also knew that this man was dangerous, that he wouldn't hesitate to use force. The park, once a tranquil haven, was now a stage for a deadly dance. The widow's waltz with the man who controlled her lost love had begun, and the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. She had to choose surrender or a dangerous fight for the truth. Chapter 7. Scars beneath the uniform. Margaret made her choice. She wouldn't surrender. Not without a fight. "No," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "These letters are mine. They're proof of who he is, of our love. You can't erase that." The man's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice a low growl. "A big mistake." He took a step towards her, his hand reaching inside his coat. Margaret tensed, bracing herself for an attack. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows behind the man. It was Henry. He looked different than he had at Grand Central. He was dressed in a dark suit, similar to the other man's, his face a mask of cold indifference. He moved with a confidence, a controlled power, that was both familiar and terrifying. "Leave her alone, Moreau," Henry said, his voice devoid of emotion. The older man, Moreau, turned to Henry, his expression a mixture of surprise and anger. "Henri, what are you doing here? I told you to stay away." "I had to see for myself," Henry said, his gaze fixed on Margaret. He looked at her, but it was as if he were seeing a stranger. There was no recognition in his eyes, no flicker of the love that had once burned so brightly. Margaret's heart ached at the sight of him. So close, yet so impossibly far. He was there, in the flesh, but the man she loved, the man who had written those letters, was gone, buried beneath layers of manipulation and deceit. "Henri," Moreau said, his voice regaining its authority, "this woman is a threat. She has information that could compromise our operation. I'll handle it, Henry said, his voice flat. He stepped towards Margaret, his eyes cold and unyielding. Margaret stood her ground, her hand still clutching the wooden box. She looked at him, searching for any sign of the man she knew, any flicker of recognition, any hint of the love they had shared. Henry, she said, her voice trembling, please remember. Remember me. Remember our life. Our plans. He stopped a few feet from her, his expression unchanging. I don't know you, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. My name is Henri Dubois. I have no past beyond what I've been told. His words were like daggers to her heart. She had hoped, against all odds, that seeing her, hearing her voice, would trigger something, would break through the walls of his amnesia. But it was clear that Moreau's control was complete. She opened the box, pulling out one of the letters. Read this, she said, holding it out to him. Read what you wrote to me. Please, Henry, remember. He hesitated, his gaze flickering to the letter, then back to Margaret. He seemed to struggle, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. Moreau stepped forward, his voice sharp. Henri, don't listen to her. She's trying to deceive you. She's an enemy. Henry looked at Moreau, then back at Margaret. The internal conflict was visible in his eyes, a battle raging beneath the surface of his carefully constructed facade. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and took the letter. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. As he read, his expression began to change. The coldness in his eyes softened, replaced by a flicker of confusion, of pain. He looked up at Margaret, his gaze searching. This is my handwriting, he said, his voice barely a whisper. But I don't remember writing this. Margaret felt a surge of hope. The letter was working, breaking through the layers of conditioning, stirring something within him. You wrote it to me, Henry, she said, her voice filled with emotion. You wrote it from the trenches. You wrote about our love, about our future. He continued to read, his eyes moving across the page, his brow furrowed in concentration. He seemed to be struggling to reconcile the words on the paper with the reality he had been told. Moreau watched them, his expression growing increasingly agitated. He knew that he was losing control, that the carefully constructed world he had built for Henry was crumbling. Suddenly, Henry clutched his head, his body swaying. He let out a groan, a sound of pain and confusion. What's happening to me? He cried, his voice filled with anguish. I don't understand, he staggered, his legs giving way. Margaret rushed forward, catching him before he fell. She held him close, her arms wrapped around him, her tears falling onto his face. The scars beneath his uniform, both physical and emotional, were laid bare. And in that moment, holding the broken man she loved, Margaret knew that the fight was far from over. It had just entered a new, more dangerous phase. Chapter 8. The Other Woman's Shadow. Henry's collapse was a turning point. The carefully constructed facade of Henri Dubois was shattered, revealing glimpses of the man beneath, the man Margaret had loved, the man who had been stolen from her. Moreau, realizing that he had lost control, made a hasty retreat, disappearing into the darkness. Elise, torn between fear and a burgeoning sense of guilt, remained behind, her eyes filled with a mixture of remorse and apprehension. With Clara's help, Margaret managed to get Henry back to her apartment, a small sanctuary she had painstakingly rebuilt after his supposed death. They laid him on the sofa, his body racked with tremors, his mind a battlefield of conflicting memories. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, he mumbled fragments of words, names and places: Margaret, Flanders, the Somme, Elise. The pieces of his shattered past were swirling around him, threatening to overwhelm him. Clara, with her wartime nursing experience, examined him, her brow furrowed with concern. He's suffering from severe psychological trauma, she said, her voice grim. The amnesia, the induced conditioning, it's all taking its toll. He needs professional help, Margaret. And he needs it soon. Margaret nodded, her heart aching for Henry. She knew that Clara was right, but she was terrified of what might happen if she took him to a hospital. Moreau's reach was long, his influence pervasive. He wouldn't hesitate to silence Henry permanently to ensure that his secrets remained buried. She looked at Elise, who stood silently in the corner of the room, her face pale and drawn. The other woman's shadow hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the deception that had torn their lives apart. "Elise," Margaret said, her voice surprisingly calm, "you know more than you're telling us. You know who Moreau is, what he's involved in. You need to help us. You need to help Henry." Elise hesitated, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She looked at Henry, his body trembling on the sofa, his face contorted in pain. I can't," she whispered, her voice filled with fear. "He'll kill me. He'll kill us both." "He's already tried to kill Henry, in a way," Margaret countered, her voice hardening. "He's stolen his mind, his memories, his identity. You have a chance to help him get it back. You have a chance to redeem yourself." Elise looked at Margaret, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and desperation. She seemed to struggle with her conscience, the weight of her past actions pressing down on her. Finally, she nodded, her resolve hardening. "All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll tell you what I know, but we need to be careful. Moreau has eyes everywhere." She began to speak, her voice low and hesitant, revealing a story of espionage, of wartime secrets, of a shadowy organization that dealt in information, in power, in control. Moreau, she explained, was a high-ranking operative, a master manipulator who recruited vulnerable soldiers, men with special skills, men who could be easily controlled. Henry, with his exceptional memory and his linguistic abilities, had been a prime target. He had been captured during a mission, subjected to brutal interrogation, and then reprogrammed. His memories had been erased, replaced with a fabricated identity, a new life as Henri Dubois. Elise had been part of the operation, a handler assigned to monitor him, to ensure his loyalty. But she had grown to care for him, to see beyond the facade, to recognize the pain and confusion that lay beneath. She had fallen in love with him, or perhaps with the ghost of the man he had once been. Her revelation was a bombshell, shattering the remaining illusions, revealing the true extent of the conspiracy. Margaret listened in stunned silence, her mind reeling from the implications. Henry, her Henry, was a pawn in a dangerous game, a victim of a cruel and elaborate plot. The other woman's shadow, once a source of jealousy and resentment, now seemed less significant, replaced by a shared sense of vulnerability, of a common enemy. As Elise finished her story, Henry stirred on the sofa, his eyes fluttering open. He looked around the room, his gaze confused and disoriented. "Margaret?" he whispered, his voice weak and trembling. Is that really you?" Margaret rushed to his side, taking his hand in hers. "Yes, Henry," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "It's me. I'm here." He looked at her, his eyes searching, a flicker of recognition dawning in their depths. The other woman's shadow might have been long, but Margaret's enduring love was proving to be stronger. The journey to reclaim him would be long and arduous, but for the first time in 3 years, Margaret felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that the man she loved was still there, buried beneath the layers of deception, waiting to be found. Chapter 9. A stolen moment in the rain. The fragile peace of Margaret's apartment was a stark contrast to the storm raging within Henry. His memories were returning, not in a flood, but in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting distorted images of his past. He remembered Margaret, her face, her voice, the scent of her lavender perfume. He remembered their courtship, their stolen kisses in Central Park, their dreams of a future together. But he also remembered Elise, their life in France, the missions he had undertaken, the secrets he had kept. The two realities collided within him, creating a maelstrom of confusion and pain. He struggled to reconcile the man he had been with the man he had become, the love he had felt for Margaret with the attachment he had developed for Elise. Elise, to her credit, maintained a respectful distance, allowing Margaret to be the primary source of comfort and support for Henry. She understood that her presence was a painful reminder of the deception, of the life that had been stolen. But she also remained a vital source of information, providing details about Moreau's operation, about the network of spies and informants that he controlled. One afternoon, as a steady rain fell outside, drumming against the window panes, Henry sat on the sofa, his head in his hands, struggling to make sense of the fragmented memories that flooded his mind. Margaret sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. She didn't push him, didn't demand answers. She simply offered her presence, her unwavering support, her love. "I remember the trenches," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The mud, the blood, the constant fear. I remember writing to you, Margaret. I remember promising you that I would come home." Margaret's heart ached at his words, at the pain and confusion etched on his face. She reached for the wooden box, pulling out one of the letters. "You did come home, Henry," she said, her voice trembling. "You just don't remember. Read this. Read your own words." He took the letter, his fingers tracing the faded ink. He began to read, his eyes moving across the page, his brow furrowed in concentration. As he read, a flicker of recognition, of understanding, crossed his features. He looked up at Margaret, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and longing. "I loved you, Margaret," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I loved you so much." "And I loved you, Henry," she replied, her tears falling freely. "I still love you." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a hesitant kiss, a tentative exploration of a love that had been lost and found, a love that had survived the ravages of war and deception. It was a stolen moment, a brief respite from the storm that raged around them. The rain continued to fall outside, washing away the grime of the city, cleansing the air. Elise, watching from across the room, felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss. She knew that she could never compete with the bond that Margaret and Henry shared, with the history that tied them together. She had been a pawn in Moreau's game, a temporary distraction, a substitute for a love that had endured. But she also felt a sense of relief, a sense of liberation. She was no longer bound by the lies, by the deception. She had a chance to start over, to build a new life, free from Moreau's control. As Margaret and Henry's kiss deepened, a symbol of a rekindled love, Elise quietly slipped out of the apartment, disappearing into the rainy night. Her role in their story was over. The stolen moment in the rain was a turning point, a confirmation that Henry's heart, despite the trauma, still belonged to Margaret. But the danger was far from over. Moreau was still out there, lurking in the shadows, plotting his revenge. The fight for Henry's mind, for his freedom, was far from over. But for now, in the quiet sanctuary of Margaret's apartment, amidst the sound of the falling rain, love had found a way to bloom again, a fragile flower pushing its way through the cracks of a broken world. Chapter 10. The Price of Survival. The stolen moments of peace were fleeting. The reality of their situation, the ever-present threat of Moreau, loomed large. Henry's fragmented memories, while offering glimpses of his true self, also made him vulnerable, a target for Moreau's manipulation. Clara, ever pragmatic, insisted that they seek help, a safe haven where Henry could recover, away from the prying eyes of Moreau's network. She contacted a former colleague, a doctor who had served with her in France, a man named Dr. Alistair Reed. He specialized in shell shock, in the psychological trauma of war, and had established a discreet clinic in the countryside, a refuge for soldiers struggling to readjust to civilian life. It was a risky move, exposing Henry to an outsider, but they had no other choice. Moreau's reach was long, his resources vast. They needed to disappear, to find a place where Henry could heal, where they could plan their next move. The journey to the clinic was fraught with tension. They traveled under assumed names, using back roads and avoiding major cities. Every stranger was a potential threat, every encounter a potential danger. Henry, still struggling with his fragmented memories, was withdrawn and anxious. He clung to Margaret, his hand gripping hers tightly, as if afraid to let go. He trusted her implicitly, but the world around him was a confusing maze of half-truths and distorted realities. The clinic, nestled amidst rolling hills and sprawling farmland, was a haven of tranquility. The air was clean and crisp, the silence broken only by the sounds of nature. Dr. Reed, a kind and compassionate man with a gentle demeanor, welcomed them warmly, assuring them of their safety. He began working with Henry immediately, using a combination of therapy, hypnosis, and medication to help him piece together his shattered memories, to confront the trauma he had endured. The sessions were grueling, emotionally draining for both Henry and Margaret. He relived the horrors of the trenches, the brutal interrogations, the systematic brainwashing he had been subjected to. He screamed, he cried, he raged against the injustice of it all. Margaret was there for him, every step of the way, offering her unwavering support, her love, her presence. She sat beside him, holding his hand, whispering words of encouragement, reminding him of who he was, of who he had been. Slowly, painstakingly, Henry began to heal. The fragments of his memory began to coalesce, forming a more coherent picture of his past. He remembered his childhood, his family, his friends. He remembered his training as a soldier, his deployment to France, his capture. He also remembered Elise, but with a clarity that had been missing before. He understood her role in his deception, her complicity in Moreau's plot. But he also recognized her genuine affection for him, her conflicted emotions, her eventual decision to help him. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the clinic, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Henry turned to Margaret, his eyes filled with a newfound clarity. "I remember everything, Margaret," he said, his voice steady and strong. "I remember our life, our plans, our love. I also remember the other life, the life Moreau forced upon me." He paused, his gaze searching. "I understand now. The price of my survival was my memory. Moreau stole that from me. He used me, manipulated me, turned me into someone I wasn't." Margaret took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "You're back now, Henry," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "That's all that matters. We're together again." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Yes," he said, his voice filled with hope. "We are. But it's not over, Margaret. Moreau is still out there. He won't give up. He'll come after me." Margaret nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we'll be ready for him," she said, her voice ringing with determination. "We'll fight him together. We'll expose him, and we'll make sure he never hurts anyone again." The price of survival had been high, but Henry had paid it. He had reclaimed his memory, his identity, his love. And now, he was ready to fight for his future, for their future. The sunset, a symbol of ending and beginning, was a testament to their resilience, their courage. The battle against Moreau was far from over, but they stood united, hand in hand, to fight another day. Chapter 11. Whispers of Espionage. With Henry's memory restored, the focus shifted from recovery to retaliation. They couldn't simply hide. Moreau would find them eventually. They needed to take the fight to him, to expose his operation and bring him to justice. Elise, despite her fear, had provided them with valuable information, details about Moreau's network, his contacts, his methods. She had revealed that Moreau was involved in selling classified information to foreign powers, using his network of spies to gather intelligence and compromise national security. Henry, with his linguistic skills and his intimate knowledge of Moreau's operation, was a key asset in their plan. He remembered codes, passwords, meeting places, and the identities of some of Moreau's key operatives. They decided to contact a trusted friend from Henry's past, a man named Captain Arthur Davies, who served in military intelligence. They knew that involving the authorities was risky, but they needed support, resources, and protection. The meeting with Captain Davies took place in a secluded safe house, a nondescript apartment in a quiet residential neighborhood. The air was thick with tension, the stakes incredibly high. Henry laid out the details of Moreau's operation, presenting the evidence they had gathered, including Elise's testimony and his own recovered memories. He explained how Moreau had recruited him, brainwashed him, and used him as a pawn in his espionage activities. Captain Davies listened intently, his face grim. He was shocked by the extent of Moreau's treachery, by the audacity of his operation. He had known Henry before the war, had served alongside him, and had always respected him as a soldier and a patriot. "This is incredible, Henry," Captain Davies said, his voice filled with disbelief. "Moreau, I never would have suspected him. He always seemed so patriotic, so dedicated to his country." "He's a master manipulator, Arthur," Henry said, his voice filled with bitterness. "He preys on vulnerable soldiers, men with special skills, men he can control. He uses them, and then he discards them when they're no longer useful." Margaret, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "We need your help, Captain Davies," she said, her voice firm. "We need your protection, and we need your assistance in bringing Moreau to justice. He's a danger to this country, and he needs to be stopped." Captain Davies nodded, his resolve hardening. "You have my word," he said. "I'll do everything in my power to help you. We'll launch a full investigation, gather evidence, and build a case against Moreau. But it won't be easy. He's well-connected, influential. He'll have powerful allies who will try to protect him." They began to plan their strategy, working late into the night, poring over maps, documents, and coded messages. They identified key targets, potential witnesses, and locations where Moreau's operatives were known to operate. The whispers of espionage filled the room, the air thick with the weight of secrets, betrayals, and the ever-present danger. They knew that they were walking a tightrope, that one wrong move could cost them everything. As the night wore on, a plan began to take shape. It was a risky plan, audacious and dangerous, but it was their only chance to expose Moreau and bring him down. They would use Henry as bait, a decoy to lure Moreau into a trap. He would pretend to be still under Moreau's control, offering him false information, leading him to a designated location where Captain Davies and his team would be waiting. It was a gamble, putting Henry in harm's way, but he was determined to do it. He wanted revenge, justice, and closure. He wanted to reclaim his life, his identity, his freedom. As the first rays of dawn peeked through the curtains, they finalized their plan. The whispers of espionage had given way to a concrete strategy, a path forward. The battle against Moreau was about to begin, and the stakes were higher than ever. Henry, once a pawn, was now a key player, ready to confront his past and fight for his future. The safe house was quiet, but the plan had been set. Chapter 12. The Rendezvous Point. The plan was set in motion. Henry, playing the role of the obedient operative, contacted Moreau, using a pre-arranged code to signal his willingness to cooperate. He offered him false information, hinting at a potential leak within military intelligence, a fabricated scandal that would pique Moreau's interest. Moreau, ever eager for an opportunity to exploit a weakness, took the bait. He arranged a meeting, a rendezvous point in a deserted warehouse district along the waterfront. The location was isolated, shrouded in darkness, a perfect setting for a clandestine exchange. Margaret, despite her fears, insisted on being present, hidden nearby, observing the operation. She couldn't bear the thought of Henry facing Moreau alone, of reliving the trauma of his past without her support. Clara, armed with a medical kit and a tranquilizer gun, accompanied her, providing a sense of security and a practical backup plan. They positioned themselves in a dilapidated building across from the warehouse, their eyes fixed on the entrance. The night was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of salt and decay. The silence was broken only by the distant cries of seagulls and the lapping of the waves against the pilings. Henry arrived first, dressed in the familiar dark suit that he had worn as Henri Dubois. He looked calm and composed, but Margaret knew that beneath the surface, he was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. He was walking back into the lion's den, confronting the man who had stolen his life, his identity, his love. He entered the warehouse, disappearing into the darkness. Margaret held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She clutched Clara's hand, her knuckles white. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence was agonizing, the tension almost unbearable. Margaret strained her ears, listening for any sound, any sign of what was happening inside. Then she saw him. Moreau emerged from the shadows, his face a mask of cold calculation. He was accompanied by 2 armed guards, their faces grim and menacing. Henry stood before him, his posture defiant, his eyes filled with a steely resolve. He was no longer the obedient pawn, the brainwashed operative. He was Henry Whitaker, a soldier, a patriot, a man fighting for his freedom. "Henri," Moreau said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "you disappoint me. I thought you were smarter than this. I thought you understood the consequences of betrayal." "I understand everything, Moreau," Henry replied, his voice steady and strong. "I understand that you're a traitor, a criminal, a man who deserves to rot in prison." Moreau's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "You're making a mistake, Henri. A big mistake. You can't win. I have allies, powerful allies who will protect me." "Your allies won't be able to help you this time, Moreau," Henry said, his voice ringing with confidence. "Your operation is over. You're finished." Moreau let out a cold laugh. "You're delusional, Henri. You think you can defeat me? You're nothing but a broken soldier, a pawn in my game." "I may be broken, Moreau," Henry said, his voice rising slightly, "but I'm not defeated. And I'm not alone." At that moment, Captain Davies and his team stormed the warehouse, their weapons drawn. The guards were taken by surprise, quickly disarmed and apprehended. Moreau, realizing that he had been outmaneuvered, tried to escape, but Henry blocked his path. The 2 men faced each other, their eyes locked in a battle of wills. "It's over, Moreau," Henry said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "Your reign of terror is over." Moreau, his face contorted in rage and desperation, lunged at Henry, his hand reaching for a hidden weapon. But Henry was faster. He disarmed Moreau, pinning him to the ground, his knee pressing against his chest. The rendezvous point, once a symbol of Moreau's power and control, had become the scene of his downfall. The trap had been sprung, the predator captured. Margaret and Clara emerged from their hiding place, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and triumph. The battle had been won, but the war for healing, for justice, was far from over. As sirens wailed in the distance, Margaret ran to Henry's side, the desolate warehouse echoing with the weight of their struggle and their victory. Chapter 13. Betrayal in the Moonlight. The arrest of Moreau and his henchmen was swift and decisive. Captain Davies and his team secured the warehouse, gathering evidence and taking the prisoners into custody. The operation, meticulously planned and flawlessly executed, was a resounding success. But as the initial euphoria of victory subsided, a nagging sense of unease settled upon Margaret. Something didn't feel right. Moreau's capture had been too easy, too convenient. He had seemed almost resigned to his fate, as if he had expected it, as if he had planned for it. She shared her concerns with Henry and Clara, but they dismissed her worries, attributing them to her lingering anxiety and the trauma of the past few weeks. "Margaret, you're overthinking this," Henry said, his voice gentle but firm. "Moreau is behind bars. His operation is dismantled. We're safe now." "I hope you're right, Henry," Margaret replied, her voice tinged with doubt. "But I can't shake this feeling that something is still off." As the days turned into weeks, life slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Henry continued his therapy with Dr. Reed, making remarkable progress in his recovery. He was regaining his strength, his confidence, his sense of self. Margaret and Henry resumed their life together, picking up the pieces of their shattered past, rebuilding their future. They moved back into Margaret's apartment, the small sanctuary that had witnessed their reunion, their struggles, and their triumphs. But the shadow of Moreau still lingered, a constant reminder of the betrayal they had endured, of the secrets that had been buried. One evening, as they were preparing for bed, Henry received a phone call. He listened intently, his face growing pale, his expression hardening. "Who was that?" Margaret asked, her voice filled with apprehension. Henry hesitated, his gaze avoiding hers. "It was Captain Davies," he said, his voice strained. He needs to see me urgently." Margaret's heart sank. She knew, instinctively, that something was wrong. "What is it, Henry? What's happened?" He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and regret. "There's been a development," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Moreau, he's escaped." The news hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her worst fears had been realized. Moreau was free, and he would undoubtedly be seeking revenge.
How?
Margaret stammered, her voice trembling. "How is that possible?" Henry shook his head, his expression grim. "There was a breach in security," he said. "Someone on the inside helped him escape." The betrayal was a devastating blow, shattering their fragile sense of security. They were no longer safe, nowhere was safe. Moreau was out there, lurking in the shadows, plotting his next move. As they stood in the dimly lit bedroom, the moonlight casting long shadows across the floor, Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. The betrayal in the moonlight was a stark reminder of the dangers they faced, of the enemies that surrounded them. "We need to leave, Henry," Margaret said, her voice urgent. "We need to disappear, to go into hiding." Henry nodded, his resolve hardening. "You're right," he said. "We can't stay here. We're sitting ducks." They packed quickly, gathering their essential belongings, preparing for a hasty departure. The apartment, once a haven of peace and love, now felt like a trap, a cage. As they were about to leave, Henry stopped, his gaze fixed on a small, framed photograph on the nightstand. It was a picture of him and Margaret, taken before the war, a memento of their happier times, of their unblemished love. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the outline of Margaret's face. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything you've been through, for everything I've put you through." Margaret reached out, her hand gently cupping his face. "It's not your fault, Henry," she said, her voice filled with love and compassion. "You are a victim just like me. We'll get through this together." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a kiss filled with sorrow, with regret, but also with a fierce determination to survive, to overcome the betrayal, to reclaim their lives. The moonlight, once a witness to their despair, now illuminated their resolve. They would face the darkness together, and they would find their way back to the light. They had to. Chapter 14. The Truth Buried in Flanders. Their flight was frantic, a desperate attempt to outrun Moreau's shadow. They abandoned their car, opting for public transportation, switching trains and buses, constantly changing their direction, trying to cover their tracks. They knew that Moreau had resources, contacts, a network of informants that stretched far and wide. He would be hunting them, relentlessly pursuing them, seeking his revenge. They ended up in a small, coastal town, a remote fishing village far from the bustling city, far from the prying eyes of Moreau's network. They rented a small cottage overlooking the ocean, a temporary refuge where they could regroup, plan their next move. But the peace of the seaside was deceptive. The fear, the uncertainty, the constant threat of discovery gnawed at them. They were living on borrowed time, knowing that Moreau could strike at any moment. Henry, haunted by the betrayal, by the realization that someone within Captain Davies' team had helped Moreau escape, became obsessed with uncovering the identity of the traitor. He spent hours poring over documents, reviewing his memories, searching for any clue, any hint that could lead him to the culprit. Margaret, while supporting Henry's efforts, urged him to be cautious. She was terrified of losing him again, of seeing him consumed by his quest for revenge. "Henry, please," she pleaded, "be careful. This is dangerous. We don't know who we can trust." "I have to do this, Margaret," he replied, his voice filled with determination. "I have to find out who betrayed us. I have to make sure that Moreau is stopped, once and for all." One evening, as they were sitting on the porch of their cottage, watching the waves crash against the shore, Henry had a breakthrough. He remembered a detail, a seemingly insignificant conversation he had overheard while he was still under Moreau's control. It was a conversation between Moreau and one of his operatives, a coded exchange that had seemed meaningless at the time. But now, with his memory restored, With the knowledge of Moreau's escape, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The conversation had mentioned a name, a codename Nightingale, and it had referred to a location, a specific field in Flanders, a place where Henry had been stationed during the war. Flanders, Henry said, his voice trembling with excitement. That's it, Margaret. That's where we'll find the answer. That's where the truth is buried. Margaret was hesitant, reluctant to return to the place where Henry had endured so much trauma, where he had been captured and brainwashed. But she knew that he was right, that they couldn't run forever, that they needed to confront their past, to uncover the truth. They decided to make the journey, a perilous trip back to the battlefields of France, back to the ghosts of their past. It was a gamble, a dangerous undertaking, but it was their only hope of finding the answers they sought, of exposing the traitor and bringing Moreau to justice. The truth was buried in Flanders, in the muddy fields where Henry had fought and suffered, where he had lost his memory and his identity. And they were determined to unearth it, no matter the cost. The cottage, with its serene ocean view, was left behind. Their journey was far more treacherous than the waves crashing just outside their window. Chapter 15. A promise torn apart. The journey back to France was arduous, filled with anxiety and the constant fear of detection. They traveled under assumed names, using forged documents, avoiding major ports and cities. The ghosts of the war, the memories of Henry's trauma, hung heavy in the air. Flanders, once a scene of unimaginable horror, was now eerily peaceful, the scars of battle slowly healing, the fields green and lush. But for Henry, it was a place of profound pain, a reminder of the life he had lost, of the promises that had been torn apart. They located this specific field, a desolate expanse of land marked by a small, weathered cross, a memorial to the fallen soldiers. The air was heavy with the weight of history, with the echoes of gunfire and the cries of the dying. Henry stood before the cross, his eyes scanning the field, his mind racing, trying to piece together the fragments of his memory. He remembered the battle, the chaos, the fear. He remembered being captured, dragged away, his pleas for mercy ignored. He walked slowly across the field, his footsteps sinking into the soft earth. He stopped at a specific spot, a small rise overlooking the surrounding area. This was it, the place where he had overheard the conversation, the place where the truth was buried. He began to dig, his hands scraping against the dirt, his fingers searching for any clue, any sign. Margaret watched him, her heart aching for him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. After what felt like an eternity, his fingers brushed against something hard, something buried beneath the surface. He dug deeper, pulling out a small, metal box, rusted and covered in mud. He opened it cautiously, his hands trembling. Inside, nestled amongst decaying leaves and dirt, was a single sheet of paper, folded and sealed with wax. He recognized the seal, the emblem of a secret society, a shadowy organization that had been operating in the shadows of the war, dealing in information, in power, in betrayal. He unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the handwritten message. It was a coded message, a list of names, operatives, and their corresponding code names. And then he saw it. The name that made his blood run cold. The name that shattered his world, that tore apart the fragile fabric of his trust. Nightingale, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. It was Captain Davies. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. Captain Davies, his trusted friend, his ally, the man who had helped them bring down Moreau, was the traitor. He had been working with Moreau all along, manipulating them, using them for his own purposes. Margaret, stunned by the revelation, rushed to his side, her hand reaching out to comfort him. "Henry," she said, her voice filled with disbelief. "Are you sure?" "Captain Davies, it can't be." Henry shook his head, his eyes filled with a profound sadness, a bitter sense of betrayal. "It's him, Margaret," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The message, it's clear. He was Nightingale. He was the one who helped Moreau escape. He was the one who betrayed us. The promise they had made to each other, the promise to fight together, to overcome the darkness, had been torn apart by the treachery of a trusted friend. The field in Flanders, once a symbol of loss and trauma, had now become a place of profound disillusionment, a testament to the depths of human deceit. As they stood there, in the middle of the desolate field, the wind howling around them, the ghosts of the past swirling about them, they felt utterly alone, betrayed, and vulnerable. The truth had been unearthed, but it had come at a terrible price. Their fight, it became devastatingly clear, was far from over. The cross stood tall over the fields, but it was their own metaphorical cross to bear now. Chapter 16. The Unsent Letter. The revelation of Captain Davy's betrayal was a devastating blow, leaving Henry and Margaret reeling with shock and a profound sense of vulnerability. They were alone, hunted, with no one they could trust. They returned to the small coastal town, their refuge now tainted by the knowledge that they were surrounded by enemies, that even their closest allies could be betrayers. Henry, consumed by guilt and anger, became withdrawn and distant. He blamed himself for trusting Davies, for leading Margaret into danger, for failing to protect her. Margaret, despite her own fears, tried to reach out to him, to offer him comfort and support. But he pushed her away, retreating into a shell of self-recrimination and despair. One evening, as they sat in silence in their small cottage, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore a constant reminder of their isolation, Margaret decided to take a different approach. She went to the wooden box, the one containing Henry's letters from the front, the letters he had written to her, but she had never received. She pulled out a letter, one she hadn't read before, one that was different from the others. It was addressed to Captain Arthur Davies. She handed it to Henry, her hand trembling slightly. "Read this," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Read what you wrote to your friend." Henry looked at the letter, his expression confused. He took it reluctantly, his fingers tracing the familiar handwriting. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words. It was a letter of gratitude, of friendship, of trust. Henry had written to Davies from the trenches, thanking him for his support, for his guidance, for his unwavering loyalty. He had shared his fears, his hopes, his dreams for the future. He had confided in him, trusted him implicitly. As Henry read the letter, his expression began to change. The anger, the guilt, the self-recrimination slowly faded, replaced by a profound sadness, a sense of loss. He looked up at Margaret, his eyes filled with tears. I trusted him," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I considered him a brother." Margaret reached out, her hand gently cupping his face. "I know, Henry," she said, her voice filled with compassion. "I know you did. And it's not your fault. You couldn't have known." The unsent letter, a testament to a friendship that had been betrayed, a bond that had been shattered, became a symbol of their shared pain, of their vulnerability. But it also became a catalyst for healing, a way for Henry to confront his emotions, to process his grief, to begin to move forward. "He used me," Margaret, Henry said, his voice raw with emotion. "He used my trust, my friendship, to further his own agenda. He betrayed everything we stood for." "I know," Margaret replied, her voice firm. "And he'll pay for it. We'll make sure of it." The unsent letter, a ghost of a past that could have been, became a source of strength, a reminder of the values they held dear, of the ideals they were fighting for. They decided to take action, to fight back, to expose Davy's treachery and bring him to justice. They couldn't rely on anyone else, they had to do it themselves. They began to plan, to strategize, to gather evidence. They knew that Davies was a formidable opponent, well connected and influential. But they were determined to overcome the odds, to reclaim their lives, to avenge the betrayal. The unsent letter, once a symbol of loss and despair, had become a beacon of hope, a testament to their resilience, their courage, and their unwavering love for each other. It spurred them forward, a quiet reminder of the man Henry once trusted and the man he now had to bring down. Chapter 17. The Weight of Two Rings. Their plan to expose Davies was fraught with peril. They were operating without support, without resources, hunted by both Moreau and a traitor within military intelligence. They had to be meticulous, cautious, and above all, united. They decided to use Davy's own methods against him, leveraging his trust in Henry's fabricated persona as Henri Dubois. Henry would contact Davies, pretending to have escaped Moreau's clutches and seeking his help. He would lure him into a trap, a carefully orchestrated meeting where they could gather evidence of his treachery and expose him. Margaret, despite her fears, insisted on playing an active role in the operation. She refused to be sidelined, to be a passive victim. She was Henry's partner, his equal, and she would stand by his side, no matter the risk. They spent days planning, rehearsing, anticipating every possible scenario. They knew that Davies was cunning and ruthless, that he wouldn't hesitate to kill them if he suspected their deception. The weight of 2 rings, Margaret's engagement ring, a symbol of their enduring love, and the memory of Elise's wedding ring, a reminder of the deception they had overcome, pressed heavily upon them. They represented the 2 worlds Henry had inhabited, the 2 lives he had lived, the 2 women who had played a significant role in his journey. One evening, as they were preparing for their final confrontation with Davies, Margaret took Henry's hand, her fingers interlacing with his. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love, fear, and determination. "Henry," she said, her voice soft but firm, "no matter what happens, I want you to know that I love you. I've always loved you, and I'll always be by your side." Henry looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound gratitude, a deep and abiding love. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a kiss filled with passion, with tenderness, with a fierce commitment to each other. "I love you too, Margaret," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "More than words can say. You're my anchor, my strength, my everything." The weight of 2 rings seemed to lighten, replaced by the strength of their bond, by the unwavering love that had sustained them through the darkness. They were ready to face their final battle, to confront the traitor, to reclaim their future. They arranged the meeting with Davies at a secluded location, a deserted warehouse similar to the one where they had captured Moreau. It was a symbolic choice, a deliberate attempt to reclaim the past, to rewrite the narrative of their betrayal. Henry arrived first, playing the role of the desperate operative, seeking Davies' help. He feigned fear, vulnerability, appealing to Davies' sense of superiority and control. Davies, unsuspecting, took the bait. He arrived at the warehouse, his demeanor arrogant and condescending. He believed that he had Henry under his control, that he was still pulling the strings. "Henri," Davies said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "you disappoint me. I thought you were smarter than this. Running to me for help? Pathetic." I didn't know where else to turn, Captain," Henry said, his voice trembling. "Moreau, he's after me. He knows I betrayed him." "You should have thought of that before you crossed him," Davies replied, his voice cold and ruthless.
"But don't worry, Henri.
"I'll take care of you. I always take care of my assets." As Davies spoke, Margaret emerged from the shadows, her face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, her hand concealed inside her coat pocket. She was holding a small, recording device, capturing every word of Davies' confession. "You won't be taking care of anyone anymore, Davies," Henry said, his voice hardening, his demeanor shifting. "Your game is over." Davies' eyes narrowed, his expression turning from arrogance to suspicion. He realized, too late, that he had been tricked. The weight of 2 rings, and the 2 intertwined lives they represented, shifted. The balance of power was about to change. Chapter 18. Redemption in the Ruins. Davies' realization that he had been betrayed was swift and brutal. His face contorted in rage, his eyes blazing with fury. He lunged at Henry, his hand reaching for a concealed weapon. But Henry was prepared. He anticipated Davies' move, sidestepping his attack and delivering a swift blow to his jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. Margaret stepped forward, her hat removed, her face revealed, her hand holding the recording device aloft. "It's over, Davies," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "We have everything. Your confession, your betrayal, your crimes, it's all recorded." Davies, stunned and disoriented, looked from Henry to Margaret, his expression a mixture of disbelief and desperation. He had underestimated them, underestimated their courage, their resilience, their love. You set me up," he stammered, his voice filled with rage. "You tricked me." "We did what we had to do," Davies, Henry replied, his voice cold and steady. "You betrayed us. You betrayed your country. You betrayed everything you stood for. You deserve to pay for your crimes." Davies scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting around the warehouse, searching for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. They had him cornered, trapped by his own treachery. "You won't get away with this," Davies snarled, his voice filled with venom. "I have friends, powerful friends, who will protect me." "Your friends can't help you now, Davies," Margaret said, her voice firm. "Your reign of terror is over. You're finished." As they spoke, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing moment. Henry had contacted Captain Davies' superiors, informing them of his treachery and providing them with the evidence they needed to arrest him. Davies, realizing that he was defeated, that his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, sank to his knees, his head in his hands, his body shaking with sobs. He was a broken man, stripped of his power, his influence, his dignity. The arrival of the authorities was swift and decisive. Davies was taken into custody, his protests and threats ignored. The warehouse, once a symbol of his betrayal, had become the scene of his redemption, a place where justice had finally been served. As Davies was led away, Henry and Margaret stood together, their arms wrapped around each other, their hearts filled with a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and a profound sense of closure. They had faced the darkness, they had overcome the betrayal, they had reclaimed their lives. The ruins of the warehouse, a testament to the battles they had fought, the sacrifices they had made, became a symbol of their redemption, a place where they had found their way back to each other, back to the light. They walked out of the warehouse, hand in hand, leaving the darkness behind them, stepping into the dawn of a new day, a new beginning. The weight of 2 rings, once a burden, now felt lighter, a reminder of the challenges they had overcome, of the love that had endured. The redemption in the ruins was complete. They were free. Chapter 19. The Journey Home. With Davies' arrest and Moreau's operation dismantled, Henry and Margaret could finally begin to rebuild their lives, to heal the wounds of the past, and to embrace the future. They returned to New York, to Margaret's apartment, the small sanctuary that had witnessed their reunion, their struggles, and their triumphs. It was a place filled with memories, both painful and joyful, a testament to their enduring love. But they knew that they couldn't simply pick up where they had left off. The war, the deception, the betrayal had changed them irrevocably. They needed to find a new normal, a new way of being together, a new way of living their lives. Henry, while grateful to be free from Moreau's control and Davies' treachery, still struggled with the trauma of his past. He had nightmares, flashbacks, moments of intense anxiety and depression. Margaret, unwavering in her love and support, stood by his side, helping him navigate the difficult journey of recovery. She encouraged him to continue his therapy, to seek professional help, to confront the demons that haunted him. They also decided to make a fresh start, to leave the city and its painful memories behind. They purchased a small cottage on the coast of Maine, a place of tranquility and beauty where they could heal, reconnect, and build a new life together. The journey home, both literally and figuratively, was a long and arduous one. It was a journey of healing, of forgiveness, of rediscovering themselves and each other. They spent their days walking along the beach, watching the waves crash against the shore, listening to the cries of the seagulls. They found solace in nature, in the beauty of the world around them, in the simple pleasures of life. Henry, inspired by his experiences, decided to dedicate his life to helping other veterans, to sharing his story, to advocating for better mental health care for those who had served their country. Margaret, who had always had a passion for writing, began to chronicle their journey, their struggles, their triumphs. She wrote about the war, the deception, the betrayal, but also about the enduring power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, the hope for a brighter future. Their journey home was a testament to their courage, their strength, their unwavering commitment to each other. It was a journey of redemption, of forgiveness, of finding peace in the aftermath of war and deception. As they settled into their new life, in their small cottage by the sea, they knew that the scars of the past would always be with them, a reminder of the battles they had fought, the sacrifices they had made. But they also knew that they had emerged stronger, more resilient, more deeply in love than ever before. The journey home had been long and difficult, but it had led them to a place of peace, of healing, of hope. The cottage, with its serene ocean view, was not just a home, it was a sanctuary, a testament to the enduring power of love, the journey to reclaim a stolen life, and the beginning of their new chapter. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. Years passed, the seasons changing, the wounds of the past slowly healing. Henry and Margaret built a life together in their seaside cottage, a life filled with love, laughter, and a quiet sense of peace. Henry's work with veterans became his passion, his purpose. He established a foundation, a support network for those who had served, providing them with counseling, resources, and a sense of community. He became a voice for the voiceless, an advocate for those who had been forgotten, a beacon of hope for those who were struggling to readjust to civilian life. Margaret's writing blossomed, her words capturing the hearts and minds of readers around the world. She published her memoir, a powerful account of their journey, their struggles, their triumphs. It became a bestseller, a testament to the enduring power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, the hope for a brighter future. But even in their peaceful haven, the echoes of the past occasionally resurfaced, reminders of the battles they had fought, the sacrifices they had made. One day, a letter arrived, a formal invitation from the French government. It was an invitation to a ceremony, a commemoration of the war, a recognition of Henry's service and his contributions to the Allied cause. The invitation stirred mixed emotions within them. It was an honor, a recognition of Henry's bravery and his sacrifice. But it also brought back painful memories, reminders of the trauma he had endured, of the life that had been stolen from him. They debated whether to attend, weighing the potential benefits against the emotional toll it might take. Henry was hesitant, reluctant to revisit the past, to confront the ghosts that still haunted him. Margaret, understanding his reservations, offered her unwavering support. "We'll go together, Henry," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We'll face it together, just like we've faced everything else." They decided to accept the invitation, to make the journey back to France, to the place where their lives had been irrevocably altered. It was a reckoning, a final confrontation with the past, a chance to honor the fallen, to remember the sacrifices, to celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. The ceremony was held in Flanders, in the very field where Henry had unearthed the truth about Davy's betrayal. The field, once a scene of desolation and despair, was now transformed, adorned with flags, flowers, and a sea of faces, veterans, dignitaries, and families of the fallen. As Henry stood there, surrounded by his fellow soldiers, by those who had shared his experiences, by those who understood his pain, he felt a sense of closure, a sense of peace. He had come full circle, returning to the place where his life had been shattered, but emerging stronger, more resilient, more determined to live a life worthy of the sacrifices that had been made. Margaret stood by his side, her hand in his, her presence a source of strength and comfort. They had faced the darkness together, and they had emerged into the light. The reckoning of love and duty had been a long and arduous journey, a testament to their enduring bond, their unwavering commitment to each other. They had faced betrayal, deception, and the horrors of war, but they had emerged victorious, their love stronger, their spirits unbroken. As the ceremony ended, the sun setting over the fields of Flanders, casting a golden glow upon the scene, Henry and Margaret walked hand in hand, leaving the past behind them, embracing the future with hope and gratitude. The reckoning was complete. They were at peace, and it was, and always would be, their time. Epilogue. The cottage in Maine became their sanctuary, a place of quiet reflection, of gentle healing, of enduring love. The ocean's rhythm, the constant ebb and flow of the tide, mirrored the rhythm of their lives, the ups and downs, the challenges and triumphs. They grew old together, their hair turning silver, their faces etched with the lines of time, their bodies bearing the marks of age. But their love remained as strong, as vibrant, as passionate as it had been on the day they had first met so many years ago. They often sat on their porch, overlooking the ocean, their hands intertwined, their hearts filled with gratitude for the life they had shared, for the battles they had fought, for the love that had endured. They remembered the ghosts of the past, the friends they had lost, the sacrifices they had made. They honored their memories, keeping their stories alive, sharing their experiences with future generations. Henry continued his work with veterans, his foundation growing, his influence expanding, his legacy enduring. He became a symbol of hope, of resilience, of the power of the human spirit to overcome adversity. Margaret continued to write, her words capturing the essence of their lives, their love, their journey. She wrote about the beauty of the world, the power of forgiveness, the importance of living each day to the fullest. Their cottage became a gathering place for friends, family, and fellow veterans, a place of warmth, of laughter, of shared stories. It was a place where memories were made, where bonds were strengthened, where love flourished. One evening, as they sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the ocean, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and gold, Henry turned to Margaret, his eyes filled with a deep and abiding love. "Thank you, Margaret," he said, his voice soft and gentle. "Thank you for saving me, for loving me, for never giving up on me." Margaret smiled, her eyes twinkling with a lifetime of shared memories. "And thank you, Henry," she replied, her voice filled with tenderness. "For coming back to me, for fighting for us, for loving me unconditionally." They leaned in, their lips meeting in a kiss that spoke of a lifetime of love, of devotion, of gratitude. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that transcended time, a kiss that would endure forever. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they held each other close, their hearts filled with a profound sense of peace. They had lived a full life, a life filled with challenges and triumphs, with sorrow and joy, with loss and redemption. They had faced the darkness together, and they had found their way back to the light. Their love had been their anchor, their strength, their guiding star. And as they drifted off to sleep, in each other's arms, they knew that their love story would live on, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a beacon of hope for generations to come. The ocean continued to sing its gentle, endless song. And in that small cottage in Maine, love finally reigned supreme.